our June virtual think tank. Thank you all for coming. Today we're going to be talking about choosing a lesson or learning segment that showcases the full range of teaching and learning. And then we're going to also talk a little bit about the TPA and how that informs IDPs. So this morning, my name is Wayne Baser. I'm with the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. We also have Lori Thornley, who's a program manager from Evaluation Systems, who will be assisting us. And our guest presenters this morning are going to be Bob Frelly. He's the Director of Music Education at Chapman University and also our CalTPA Lead Assessor for Music. And also joining us will be James Webb, and he's also one of our consultants at the Commission. So once again, here's our two topics for this morning's presentation. And we will sort of have, question and answer time. If you have questions that come up throughout the discussion, please put those in the chat room. And, Lori will be monitoring the chat room. And if we have questions that come up that pertain to that particular part of the discussion, we'll stop and answer your questions and go from there. So you've all been muted upon entry. So once again, if you have a question, please put that in the chat room and we will address those as we go through the presentation here this morning. So once again, welcome. So Bob, I'm going to hand it over to you, and here we go.
All right, thanks. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, especially during the summer when we know there are a lot of things going on and finally get a chance to get out maybe and get some air, but hope you're all safe and healthy, and thanks again for joining us today. So it's a long title. The idea is just to kind of give some thoughts as far as how to prepare lesson plans and learning segments directed towards the TPA, but also just for enhanced learning down the road as you begin planning for the future. So I put together an agenda here, and this PowerPoint, I guess, will be available to you at some point, but we'll walk through this, and at some point, if you have some questions, anybody wants to, we have Lori Thornley, who's going to be monitoring the chat, I believe, and so we'll kind of have time to answer questions at that point, but also at the very end, we'll have some time for some Q&A. So to get things started, I started with a quote here from Socrates, and when we do presentations, I won't necessarily read through every single slide since you have it in front of you, but I thought this was a telling quote to kind of get us started. Cannot teach anybody anything, I can only make them think. And there's Socrates there. And then I put my own kind of thought as far as what that means is, we ask questions that we help teachers or help students find the answers, but that's not always the end result, right? The end result is trying to develop a road for them that can actually lead to answering the question. So learning is a step-by-step process. And while there is an end result, perhaps in learning knowledge, it's really how we get there that helps to develop the student. And that is what helps distinguish a solid lesson plan and learning segment. Next slide, please. And then I thought I'd pull one up from Benjamin Franklin. Tell me I forget, teach me I remember, involve me and I learn. You probably all heard that one before too. And the idea of a solid lesson plan involves, as we all know, students engaging in the activity itself. And so we kind of view our role as teachers as being guiding their experiences and helping them discover things on their own to hope to extend their learning beyond just that individual lesson. Next slide, please. And then this is a nice one too. I mean, if we think back to our favorite teachers in school, if you're like me, the ones that I remember aren't necessarily the subject matter that I learned, but how they made me feel and how they made me think and understand knowledge. And I think that's what we really remember are the experiences rather so much than the information. And it's the inspiring teachers that have made a big difference in all of our lives. And I think that's what we want to keep in mind as we go through and do our own lesson plans. All right, next slide. So a learning segment, within the TPA, there's a learning segment that's required in step 2 specifically. And this can apply to TPA, but also just in your general unit and segment planning. And it can be anywhere from 3 to 5 days of consecutive instruction, centered on a common central focus. And I think that's the key throughout the learning segment, that there is a focus that can be evident in each of the lessons themselves. And each of the lessons will have an identifiable beginning and ending point. The second point there is we want to be sure that we keep opportunities for students to engage in higher order thinking. Sometimes it's called HOTS, higher order thinking skill. but also along the way develop their academic language within the specific content. My academic area is music, so later on we'll have a couple ideas for music, but you can just apply that to whatever your area happens to be. And then there's also a requirement that students engage and use some form of educational technology, and as well as any kind of assistive technologies that's going to enhance and provide access to learning. Now, what's identified as educational technology, it's going to vary depending on the discipline, and there's some good guidelines within the handbooks of the TPAs, and also some good websites that will tell you exactly what are some solid types of educational technology. And Wayne Baser, who's here on our call, he's kind of a tech expert too, so he can always help guide along the way. Right, Wayne?
Absolutely.
All right, cool. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So learning segment is always going to have a central instructional focus. And within that focus, you're going to have the standards, the objectives, and so forth that are all tied within the curriculum. So in defining a learning segment, sometimes we think of how do we get started? Well, first you want to identify a central focus. And within that focus, determine some kind of a segment to plan, teach, and analyze that's going to help you address a focus or the concept. And again, with the TPA, it's 3 to 5 lessons. And then a plan is a separate plan for each individual lesson, but all that they're tying into one another. And we'll kind of talk about that again as time moves forward. All right, next slide. And as we do the presentation, if you feel I'm either going too fast, too slow, you want to pause, just go ahead and make a comment in the chat, and we'll be happy to accommodate if you'd like that. So we refer to the central focus, and the central focus has several key points here. Within that, it's going to be description of what the lesson or in the unit is trying to accomplish. So there's a central focus that takes place through the entire segment itself. And within there, each one of those lessons will have a focus that's tied to the overall focus. That kind of makes sense, right? They're kind of all tied in together. But initially, this general focus is going to be a little bit more on the general side. It's kind of a concept more than anything else. So the key is not to get too bogged down in specifics within the general focus or the central focus, but rather what you're going to be doing along the way to help address a general concept. Like for music, for example, it could be the concept of rhythm. Or rhythm has a steady beat, and then you can get more focus within each individual lesson. And within the focus itself, you're not going to really list what the skills are that the students are going to acquire. That's part of it, but it goes beyond that level as well. And we're talking about what the students will achieve in the future. So the focus at the beginning of the segment tells you what they're going to be learning by the end of the segment itself. And it's going to be with increasing levels of mastery, right? So every lesson will tie in from one to another, progresses along the way until they actually will reach and achieve what your goals and concepts would be. It's important that they align with the content standard, the state standards. There are new standards that are in the process of being adopted. They were approved last year, but they're still under review, and the framework itself is also had been worked on. I was part of the team that worked on some of the framework for the visual performing arts. So you want to be sure that you take a look at the frameworks that are there. Different disciplines are in different levels of development. So just want to be sure you check with the state on that. And then you want to be sure that you address the subject-specific components within the learning segment as well, clear and starting and ending points. And then before you get even started, you'll have to know where the students are. And that's where the prior assessment of their knowledge and development. And there are parts in the TPA that ask for that as well, where you'll be asked to comment on the student's prior knowledge and how you're going to use that prior knowledge to develop your lesson segment and how it all ties together. All right, next slide, please. So the central focus has 3 areas: what, why, and how, right? So what you're going to be teaching, the content, skills, and connections. Why is it important, right? And then how, and how you're going to be going about that. What standards, what learning objectives that you're going to be using, what learning strategies, and then how it's going to tie with other lesson plans to develop an overall unit. And you probably already are familiar with developing units, but again, this is just some things to think about. All right, next slide. Within this lesson plan, we want to be sure that all the lessons are sequential and tying from one to another. and that to maintain the standards and the central focus will be consistent throughout. And in doing so, I found, at least for my use and for my students at the university, is that if we use the same words or phrases across the lesson, then there's a logical tie-in. And not only does it help the reader follow that, but it helps you guide your own thoughts as well, to be sure that you are on the same page with you're basically where you thought you were going to be. In other words, by the time you hit step 3, you haven't gone off on a tangent from where you were on step 1, but it helps guide consistently throughout the process. And yes, the lessons can become more challenging and more sophisticated throughout the segment itself, but at least there's some continuity. And again, the same phrases, same words will certainly help in guiding that continuity. All right, next slide. Okay, this is my favorite graphic. I mean, it was worth it. Your price of admission was worth it just to come and see this. So there's the chicken and there's the egg. So the question is, how do we get started? I know there are standards, and there's always a lot of pressure to ensure that your lesson molds to the standards. But then sometimes we feel a little bit constricted, feeling that the standards doesn't give us enough leeway or enough freedom to kind of work around the lesson that we want to devise. And that's okay. You can go either way. You can either start with scenario 1, which is you figure out what your learning targets are, you identify the central focus, right? You know what you want the students to learn. And then from that point, you go back into the state standards and you kind of pick and choose and see which ones kind of satisfy what you're trying to do. And then in that way, you can say, well, maybe I presented the information in this way. It really doesn't reach this standard, but it seems that there's a California content standard that is close that might fit in there. So then maybe you adapt your lesson slightly to ensure that you meet the standard. Or the standards give you different ways of looking of how to go ahead and present your material. So it kind of complements each other. And then the second scenario is that maybe you do have a specific standard that you want to begin with. So you start with that, and then you can go ahead and write your learning targets and identify the focus and kind of develop your lesson plan around that. Recognizing that, again, the standards are guidelines and there's enough leeway and flexibility within the standards that you can write a lesson plan that will incorporate the standards with not being too rigid, right? Because we know we need to be flexible in working with students. All right, next slide, please. This is taken directly from the TPA handbook, the handbook 2 for cycle 2, but it's the same for both. And it talks about what UDL is. And you probably heard about UDL, and it's kind of a sophisticated term, but it really comments on what good teachers have been doing all along. And that is, you're addressing all the needs of all the students and addressing their individual learning differences. And that last sentence, I think, is important there, and that we need to recognize, respect, and utilize each student's strengths, experiences, and their background as assets for teaching and learning. And assets is the key word there, because we know that we'll look at our students, we might say that some students might have a greater gift for this particular skill than another, but the truth is all students have assets. And I think we recognize that. So we want to be able to tap into their assets to ensure that our lesson plans can reach all students. And that's what UDL is. All right, next slide, please. And UDL has 3 guiding principles. And principle 1 is the what. It's basically you want to provide multiple means of presentation. That's the what of the learning process. And the second principle is multiple means of action and expression, which represents, the how of the learning. And then the last is why, how you're going to do that, how you're going to engage the students, what kind of learning activities are you going to ask them to engage in. All right. Next slide. When you're devising the lesson plan for UDL, some points to consider. You want to use what you know about their assets, their learning needs, their learning context, and that guides your planning and teaching of the lesson, again, tied back to the California standards and the framework. And then you also want to be sure that you use content-specific pedagogy of your discipline. When the TPAs are read and when they are scored by experts in the field within that discipline. And the experts are familiar with general terms that are used in all disciplines for education, but then also specific. So your students also need to be sure that they are learning content specific. So if you're using words that are common, I would say, like, for example, in music, if you use the word rhythm, you wouldn't have to go through and define what rhythm is. It's understood. And the people who are going to be reading the TPA, the assessors, they understand that. So, but you want to be sure that your students have that opportunity to learn about the academic language. And then the lessons, you want to make sure you engage, again, the higher order thinking. And that's the analysis, synthesis, evaluation, interpretation, and transfer. We all remember we have that Bloom text, right? That the whole pyramid that shows from the bottom all the way up, as far as being sure that we select activities and questions from all the different levels of the pyramid. And the higher you go, right, the more challenging and usually the more advanced thinking is involved. And you want to be sure you address that. And having said that, the top of the pyramid doesn't just represent high school, right, or college, or upper age or grade level. We often associate that with higher level thinking in older students, but there are certainly ways that even kindergartners can engage in higher order thinking, which is appropriate for their level of development. Right? Okay, moving on, next slide. Oftentimes when you get a teaching job or when you're in a teaching situation, you'll have some curriculum that's either mandated by the state or maybe mandated by the district, or maybe there's something popular. If you're doing 8th grade math, maybe there's a text that is common that everybody at your school uses. Maybe it's not mandated, but they've been using that one for a long time and they're comfortable with it, so you're going to use it as well. And those are fine to use. I mean, the curriculum guides are certainly give you a good information, and there's some tried and true ones out there. What's important would be that second bullet point is that you adapt it as you need to meet your students' learning needs, so that it's not just simply on this day we're doing page 7 and so forth. And I'm sure you know that, but just the guides are there to adapt to what your particular learning environment is, knowing that every district is different. Even with every district, every school is going to be different. Every student will be different. So whatever your specific needs will be, that's what you want to be able to accommodate. We mentioned differentiated instruction. That ties back to the UDL. So be sure that everybody has an opportunity to learn, so you address different learning styles. And then there's scaffolding techniques and additional support for students that might be either tied back to their IEP, a 504. Maybe there's some student has some significant challenging situation in school, maybe outside of school in their life experiences, but you want to be constantly aware of that as you develop a plan for good strategies. And then the bottom, I just put that there. Again, we're guiding, right? We really are guiding our student learning, tying us back into Socrates and Ben Franklin and the Japanese proverb. We want to showcase their achievements and abilities. And I think that's important, right? We want to show what they can do. That doesn't mean we ignore what they are unable to do, but we use what they can do. We use their strengths and we use their achievements as a way of developing other aspects of their learning that might need some more care and attention, right? But in doing so, we're addressing the entire range of all of our students. All right, next slide, please. Each individual lesson has some certain characteristics. Sometimes you might hear them called as objectives. Sometimes they're called learning targets, whatever term you like to use. I like to use objectives with my students, and it's clearer for me, but learning target certainly works, and TPA will use that as well. But the important thing is that they are aligned to the standards, and they're always tying right back to what your central focus is. And that just helps guide our lesson planning. It guides our activities for our students. And in doing so, these are going to be very brief. But the key is not so much the length, but how clearly the objectives or your learning target is going to indicate what the students should know or be able to demonstrate at the end of the lesson. And each objective, to be truly functional and successful and for your students' learning, need to be observable, needs to be measurable, and needs to be attainable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. All right, next slide, Wayne. Thank you. Learning target objectives. We want to write it in a language comprehensible by students. So this is an opportunity for us to share with our students what the objective is and what our learning target, what we want them to learn. So this is not the time to write it in elevated terms that might be appreciated in upper, in psychological circles or in DMA circles. We want to write it for our students to be able to understand. And when you're doing it, you want to ensure you include academic language. So I put a simple one here and I reference music. Students will demonstrate, that's important, that's observable, an understanding of common time, that's right, that's the concept, by creating, there's the activity, or four-measure phrase. So you're now identifying exactly what you're looking for, with each measure equaling 4 quarter notes. So you're very specific in what you're asking for them. So it's not vague. It's not the students are going to demonstrate understanding rhythm. Well, what about rhythm? So we need to have specific and simple guidelines for that. Another thing about an objective, it doesn't have to occur at only one point in the lesson. It can occur anytime. It can occur in the beginning. It can occur at the end. Usually we think of it as being occurring in the main body of the activity of the lesson itself, but it doesn't need to be. That is just simply the main activity, but objectives can be anywhere throughout the lesson, and it doesn't have to be time consuming. It could be very brief. It could be something as simple as a 15, 30-second measure, but not measure as in music, sorry about that, but just as in assessment and evidence, what you're looking for, right? Just something very brief that can be sure that you understand their learning. It can be longer, but it doesn't have to be. All right, next slide, please. Within the process, you want to be sure that it's very descriptive. So we want to start with where are the students, where are they going to go, right? You have to know where they started, but then where are your students going? How will you know, or I'm sorry, how are they going to get there? And then how will you know when they've arrived, right? So you have to be sure that we keep that in mind as we guide our objectives, but also within the individual lesson. All right, next slide. So some things to consider. Questions to ask ourselves as we're writing our lesson. Does it permit adjustment for students with different abilities, right? That's being able to reach all students in different learning styles and abilities. Does it encourage students to become continually involved, right? It's an involvement. The learning process, we all know we learn from doing something, right? So are they constantly doing something? And doing something can be a mental process as well, not just physical, but it's the thought that they're actually being involved themselves. It's not just a lecture. And does the lesson have content, or pardon me, coverage for the content to be learned for all students? Does it allow opportunities for you as a teacher to monitor their progress as time moves forward? And if there are students who don't learn the first time around, do you have opportunities within the lesson to give them assistance to maybe get it again, or maybe present the material in a slightly different way? Or maybe for one student, you say it this way, with another student, maybe it's visual, maybe it's oral, perhaps maybe it's physical, maybe it's bodily kinesthetic, but how do they learn? And we want to be sure you have all those different options within your lesson plan to reach all different learning modes. And then finally, within the lesson itself, are they allowed enough time to practice and really consolidate and integrate all their skills before you're going to be able to determine if they've reached the objective? And that's key too. This, in a lesson, you want to be sure that there's time to develop it. So maybe an objective might be in a larger, broader scale of things, and maybe a lesson's planned over 2 days. But the idea is that you give them time to develop the necessary skills and understanding to be able to achieve the objective. All right, next slide. We hear a lot about talking about goals. What's your goal? What's your objective? And sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. I think there really is a distinction between the two, and I'll try to walk through here, at least from my perspective, and you might have a different thought on your own. And if you do, I'd love to hear your thoughts at the end. But the idea of a goal is to determine a purpose, an aim, a rationale, why you and your students are going to engage in this particular activity in this class time. Why are you there? And then within that, you also want to express intermediate lesson goals. And those intermediate goals can draw upon previous plans and previous activities they may have done earlier within that segment. And it helps prepare the students for activities coming down the road in another segment. Right? So you're always tying to what you've done or what their prior knowledge is, and tying back to what you are asking them to acquire down the road. And when you write the goal is typically very broad educational goals that are always going to be aligned to the state curriculum standards. And if you looked at the standards, The standards are intentionally broad. Sometimes you might think they're vague, but they give you the flexibility and the wiggle room to adapt it as needed. So there's value in that. And that's kind of what you want to think about when you're writing your overall goal. And we'll look at some examples down the road here. All right, next slide. Objectives: observable, measurable, attainable. There we go. So again, you have to be able to observe what they're doing to know if they're achieving it. You have to have already established some kind of a rubric or some kind of measure that you're looking for. How do you know the students are going to reach the goal, or pardon me, or the objective leading towards the goal, unless you've already determined what it is you're looking for? You know, oftentimes I know with younger teachers, they may think about it after the fact and may not be very specific as far as how they're going to measure it. That's the key, right? Be sure that you measure it, and then also be sure it's attainable. You don't want to give the students too much to do that's well beyond their heads. So if you're teaching first grade and you don't want to necessarily teach them calculus unless you got some people who are really quite advanced, but you understand what we're talking about, right? The goal has to be observable, measurable, attainable, as well as the objective. Okay, next, please. So within that, the objective, just some things to tie it together here is you want to describe exactly what the students will do. What are they going to be doing to learn, to develop, get further knowledge, develop their skills? And that's what we call the learning activities. So you'll see within the TPA is asking, what are the students going to be engaging in? And this is where you want to be sure that that activity ties back to what your objective is, which then ties back to the learning goal and the central focus. Within here, you want to draw from the broader aims of the plan, but you want to be sure that it's achievable within a well-defined time period. Ideally, each lesson are going to have 1 or 2 solid goals, maybe even 3, depending on how deep the lesson goes and how long the lesson is as well. But you want to be sure it functions well within that time period. You want to be able to determine how the students will demonstrate that they've learned and understood the objectives. You know, the idea of simply asking students, do you get it? And you get the thumbs up. I mean, that can work for certain things. But if you really want to determine if they achieve the objective, that doesn't really give you the information that you need. Because I think we all know that if you're like me when I was a kid in school and I wasn't quite sure and my neighbor did this, I would go, yeah, okay, yeah, I got it. And I wouldn't necessarily, right? So you have to be sure that the students engage. It's just like yes and no questions, right? Yes and no questions really don't help the student, nor does it help you determine if they understand it. So be sure that's something you can clearly identify. And then under what condition will the student performance be accomplished? Again, performance, not music, but just the activity themselves. And then what is a degree or criterion that the satisfactory attainment? How are you going to know? What are you determining as being satisfactory? Because we know that all students will learn differently, and not all students are going to achieve the same level of understanding, but we want them to at least achieve a minimal level of understanding, a satisfactory level, and what is that? What would that look like? So you want to be sure that you've identified that as well as exceed. So within TPA2, if you've looked through that, you'll notice that there are 3 students that you're asked to show examples of their formal assessment, and one is below expectations, meets, and then exceeds expectation. And within that, you're asked to develop a rubric. And this is where that rubric will certainly help you, just even an informal basis as you see if they've addressed or reached the objective. All right, next slide. You want to phrase the objective in behavioral terms, and this is important. The students will demonstrate an understanding of blank by blank, and I always have my students do that. So in this case, the students will demonstrate an understanding of a concept, whatever the concept happens to be, by an action, the learning activity. What are you asking them to do? And when you're submitting that within the TPA as well, it's really clear because then you know what you're looking for. The students will know what they have to do to achieve it, and then anybody down the road will know. If you're doing a lesson plan for a substitute, I mean, how many times have substitutes stepped in and I served as a substitute for a year, getting my teaching credential, and I'd hated walking into a situation, be giving a lesson plan that's so vague, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, versus one that's very specific and has clear objectives, and I can know just stepping in there what it is the students are asked to do. And that tells me that the teacher is very engaged in the activities with the students and really has written a good segment, so I kind of know where things fall. Include specifically what they're going to do. Again, if put music, for example, are they going to be playing, singing, clapping? Are they going to articulate in writing? Example, just be very, very specific what you want them to do. And students of all ages can do this. And then include the specific content of the action. Is it going to be a scale, a rhythm, maybe something dealing with dynamic contrasts? And again, I put it all in music just because that's my content area. So you can adapt that for your own, of course. And then include the accuracy threshold acceptable for that particular lesson. Again, that's what you mean satisfactory achievement. So same thing. All right, next slide, please. So I just put together a couple of examples here of some objectives. First, we're going to have some poor ones, then we'll have some better ones, and then some great ones. So looking at music, we have the 5-star system here. Okay, so the poor objective is learning about steady beat and pulse. Well, what's wrong with that? What does it tell us? How are you going to know what about steady beat and pulse do you want them to learn? The students will know the difference between a major and a Dorian scale. Again, on what scale, pardon the pun, are you going to be measuring? How will you know, right? And what kind of scale? And more specific, there's not enough specifics. And students will understand rhythms in 5/8 meter. What does understand mean? How do you know? Where are the specifics? So this gets a 1-star. Now the next one are objectives of better ones. So Wayne, next slide, please. So here's an example of a better one. Students will be able to clap, pat a steady beat while singing a rote song. Okay, so Wayne, we're going to look at these three. Then, if you don't mind, we're going to slide back to the poor ones again. So look at that one. The students will be able to sing a Dorian scale. All right, now we're specific. Oop.
Wrong way.
Actually, we just want to go back to the poor one. There we go. All right, so learning about steady beat and pulse, and then we have students know the difference between, right? So far we see in the better one, it's more specific. So we can slide back to the better one, Wayne. There we go. And then for the third one, very specific, the students will be able to perform rhythmic patterns in 5/8 meter in preparation to perform our Indian dances by Alfred Reed. Okay, it's pretty good, right? We get an idea of what we're looking for. We can see what we're asking the students to do. We understand the concept now, and we know what the action is going to be. Now, if we go one step further, this one gets 3 stars, and the next one is going to get 5 stars. Now, it's very specific. It's a little more wordy, but it's okay, because the clearer you are in writing the objective, the better it will guide your teaching. It's going to keep you on track. You know exactly what you're doing. You know exactly what the students are going to be asked to do, what they need to learn, and what you're asking them to do, right? Sometimes students are going to say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Or maybe they'll perform something for you or hand in an exam, but to you, it's not clear enough, maybe as us as teachers, because we didn't provide enough information as far as what we're looking for, right? What's the knowledge we want? So here's, if you look at the first one there, that one's very specific at this point. That's identifying how many beats per minute, a specific song, and with what accuracy. Second one as well, right? And this time we're mentioning specifically a mode and a scale, and now we're tying it into a certain song that the students would be learning. And again, we're identifying an accuracy, specific accuracy. And then the last one here is, again, it was still talking about rhythmic patterns and groupings, but now we've really got into the meat of it. It's 2 + 3, 3 + 2 combinations. And whether or not you understand necessarily what it is musically, the idea is that you can see it's much more specific. We're asking, we know exactly what to look for. There are no questions about it, and we know what accuracy we've identified, the success rate. So the clearer and the more specific the objectives, the better the lesson plan will be and the greater your learning students will be. All right, next slide, please. Just a couple more slides here. A helpful tip when creating objectives. You want to be considered what they're learning. Is it going to be a new skill, a new rule of formula? Is it going to be maybe a concept, maybe a specific fact or an idea? Are you asking them to develop an attitude or understand an attitude of something? Or is it a value? You want them to value something within your lesson itself. So that will help. Once you identify what it is that you're really asking for them, that will help guide what type of activity you will do for your students. So for example, if it's a demonstration mode, you might want to list it as such, as it's listed there. In explanation mode, you want to outline the information to the students before it's explained. If it's a discussion, then maybe you want to provide them a list of key questions to help guide the discussion. And that's also for you as well. So depending on what's they're learning might determine exactly how you're going to present the information. Okay, next. Venn diagram, we've all know these, right? Measurement, assessment, and evaluation. That's part of the teaching process, and they overlap in their functions. And oftentimes it's kind of difficult to determine which is which. But we start with measurement. That's the process, right, by which the attributes or the dimensions of some physical object are determined. And then within that ties into assessment. Okay, that's a process as well by which information is obtained related to a known objective or goal. And then evaluation, at this point, you're comparing the information, the data, to the standard that you developed for the particular purpose of understanding or seeing if the students have understood the concept, right? And once we can determine how well the students are understanding, that lets us know as teachers how well we are doing as teachers in helping guiding them understanding the information. So every time we go through a lesson, we're really constantly being flexible and adapting our lesson at the moment as well. And that's a key ingredient of the TPA as well. One of the questions is, how flexible were you during the informal assessment to be able to adapt the lesson depending on what the information your students are giving and what their progress is? And then you have an opportunity within TPA to either go back and reteach a lesson or extend the lesson. So it's constant self-assessment that we do as teachers that determine how successful our students are going to be, right? That's hard to do sometimes because I know when we're teaching during the school day, we get done with one lesson and immediately we have to jump onto another lesson, and we never have time to stop and jot notes to ourselves as far as what went well, what we want to think about or reflect on. So if there is any possibility of building it into the system in our day, it's almost impossible. But I found even a simple little chart that I will keep on my desk or music stand to make notes and just mark off checkpoints to let me know what worked, what didn't work, what I have to do different next time, which particular students might need additional or different types of assistance. So any kind of self-assessment will really help constantly guide us through the measurement as well. All right, next. You can kind of read through these on your own, but here's an example of what evidence is provided through the measurement itself, and that ensures students have arrived at their intended destination. You have to provide evidence when you do the TPA, but it's important that we do this at any step of the way. So how will you evaluate? Have the students practiced it, an opportunity to learn about it from practicing? Have you provided students the opportunity to practice on what they will be assessed? And that, when you're doing that, that's a time to avoid introducing any kind of new material during the activity, right? Be sure that it's something that they're reinforcing rather than trying to learn new. Higher order thinking is really important, but only works if it's been sequential, if it's scaffolded up to that point. So if they haven't engaged at any higher order thinking, when you're asking that at the evidence point, you're setting them up for failure because they haven't had a chance to reach up to that point to understand it well enough to engage in higher level thinking. So be sure that there are steps that guide them along the process. And that was that slide with the arrows, right? Being sure that you're constantly moving through. And then, of course, there are the three types of assessment that we always do as good teachers, and that are part of the TPA as well. And that's the informal self-assessment and formal assessment. And each one will have rubrics, right? Rubrics is kind of a funny word, but it's essential, helps guide our teaching and guide the activities and learning. Along the bottom of the page there, I came across a website that I found pretty helpful in developing rubrics that I share with my students and I'll use for myself as well. So I thought I'd pass that along there for your knowledge. And then finally, we just have a couple slides here dealing with 6 common mistakes that I have encountered myself. And yes, we all still continually do this, right? So we're always kind of improving and checking ourselves. The objective doesn't specifically ask what the student will do. That's the first one. The second one, it doesn't connect. The assessment itself is disconnected from the behavior indicated in the objective, right? So there's always that connection, and you can always read the rest of the description there. But you want to be sure it's based on the same behavior that is incorporated within the objective. And that's an instance where the use of the same words, the same phrases, and the consistency will help tie that all together. The third one, maybe the prereqs are not specific or they're inconsistent with what the students are asked to do to really succeed with the lesson. And there's research indicates as much as 70% of learning is dependent on the students having the appropriate prereqs, right? So they have to, that's where the prior knowledge comes in. And I think we all understand that. All right. And then next slide. And then the last three mistakes, materials specified in the lesson are extraneous to the actual described learning activities. So you want to be sure that any materials you're asking the students to use or that you list in your lesson plan, make it an important part of the process. And then the instruction with the teacher will gauge, maybe it's not efficient. You know, maybe we're putting too much time in and not getting a good result, right? So it's a combination of effort and result. Maybe there are ways of getting the same result, but maybe less effort, right? Achieving more and doing less. And that's often called efficiency of motion, right? That's exactly what we're talking about as a musician, and as teachers as well in any activity. How can we achieve more by doing less, conserving our energy and be sure it's a focused energy? And then lastly, the activities they describe in the lesson plan don't contribute in a direct or effective way to the objective itself. So that's just tying it right back into the objective there. And then lastly, I'll end with a quote here. And education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And I think we all can agree to that. We want the students to gain that knowledge, but it's sparking that energy, right? Get that spark of a light, the turning on of a light bulb that inspires them to learn more, to develop learning on their own, but also ways of understanding, which leads to greater development of learning and understanding of material down the road. So that's my portion of the presentation. Kind of fast and furious. I wish we could have done a Q&A during it, but the setting doesn't allow it. But Wayne, do we want to allow questions at the end? Want to have James do his? And Lori, I don't know if there are any questions in the chat.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat at this time, but certainly if any of you have questions for Bob, go ahead and type them in. If we don't have any immediate questions, maybe we move on to James, and then if something comes up, we can address it after.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lori, and thank you, Bob, and we'll move over to James. So James, we'll hand this off to you.
Thank you, Bob and Wayne. So the reason that we were going to provide some information around the induction individual development plan is that there was some conversation at last week's commission meeting with regard to the IDP and its role in helping induction programs receive candidates so that they can begin an induction program that is robust and rich to the candidate's needs. So what I'm going to do today is just give you some information about what the IDP should consist of and what the executive order that was handed down late May would help you in transforming your IDP to look at the new requirements. And then I'm also going to share 2 IDPs from institutions that have had success with their transition plans going from the preliminary program into the induction program. So I wanted to start with this program standard. This is program standard 6 of the preliminary multiple subject, single subject preliminary programs. This is also similar to the program standard that's also in the education specialist programs. As we know, education specialist programs are now transitioning to the new standards, but they have a similar piece in this. And Wayne, if you could just press the next button, because I want to pay particular attention to this piece right here. Oh, go back, sorry. So it does say that before exiting the program, candidates, district employed supervisors, and program supervisors collaborate, emphasis on the word collaborate, on an individual development plan, or IDP, that consists of recommendations for professional development and growth in the candidate's CLEAR program. Also, what's important is that it is a portable document that is archived by both the preliminary program and provided to the candidate for transmission to the CLEAR or induction program. So I wanted to emphasize what is in yellow and also to remind programs that this is a document that is collaboratively completed. So if we could go to the next slide. So here are some must-haves that the IDP should contain. It must be developed, collaboratively with the candidate, the program supervisor, and the district employed supervisor. It is not a document that should be given to the candidate and say, here, go, complete it, and call me when you're done. Instead, it should be looking at evidence, and the master teacher, the candidate, the program supervisor should all be working together to work on this document. It must address the adopted teaching performance expectations, or TPEs, because as we all know, the teaching performance expectations are closely tied to the California standards for the teaching profession, which the candidate will work with as he or she enters induction. So you identify, or the candidate identifies, the areas where the candidate has strength and recommendations for professional growth goals. What worked during the program, what the candidate really showed some strong areas of focus, but then also what might the candidate want to work on as he or she transitions into the district or school in which he or she has been hired. And the way that the IDP is built is it looks at a variety of sources to inform the candidate and the other folks in crafting the IDP. So results on performance assessments, so certainly the CalTPA fits into this, also possibly the RECA, if that is applicable to the recommendation of the credential. Course assignments that were created, observations during clinical practice, and finally, any other key indicators that the program has that they might want the candidate to focus on as the IDP is built. So moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about what an IDP is and what it isn't. So Wayne, if you could press the first button so we could go to what it is. An IDP, as I've said, is collaboratively constructed. It is not an individual assignment. It is something that should be built together with the master teacher that supervised the candidate's university supervisor, and any other person or persons who could provide input to help craft that IDP. The IDP is built upon the teaching performance expectations that were the units of measure within the preliminary program, and then how that then could build into the CSTPs. The IDP is shared with the induction program. The induction program has different mechanisms by which they may receive the IDP, but it is expected that when a candidate enrolls in an induction program that the IDP is shared, because in the induction program standards, there are specific areas by which the individual learning plan, which is the document that guides a candidate's journey in induction, is built upon the transition plan that the candidate brings from the preliminary program. The IDP must be retained by the candidate and the program, generally in an electronic format. And the reason that it is retained by the program is so that the candidate can have easy access in case he or she has lost their own copy. Many programs may use online data storage systems such as TaskStream or other areas by which they can access it electronically. And finally, an IDP is informed by data. Data would include performance assessment results, could include course results, and any other type of program-specific measurement. Now, Wayne, if you could click, I'd like to show what an IDP is not. An IDP is not to be used for evaluative purposes. An IDP is not to land into the hands of an administrator after the candidate has been hired to make them think whether or not they made the right choice. It should not be used in any way to evaluate a teacher for the purposes of employment. It is only to be used as a source for professional growth and development. It should not be a final written assignment in a course in which the candidate is completing it in isolation. Again, it should be a collaborative document in which multiple sources of evidence are informing its creation. It should not be constructed only by the candidate. Again, collaboration is key to this document. And finally, it should not be based in subjective ideas or on opinion. Everything should be grounded in data, and that data should be what has been observed in the classroom, what has been seen on performance assessments, much like what Bob shared earlier in terms of, as Bob was discussing objectives and assessments. Again, that's where the data should guide the creation. Okay, Wayne, if you could continue. So what I wanted to touch on now is, what did the executive order do to possibly add some other provisions of the IDP? Just as a reminder, with the executive order that was issued on May 29th, the statutory requirement for candidates to pass the performance assessment for the preliminary teaching credential was moved to the CLEAR. So in moving it to the CLEAR, the IDP should be a document in which it includes those requirements that the candidate needs to fulfill prior to the recommendation of the CLEAR credential. And for most candidates, it would be what they need to do for their CalTPA, and also, if applicable, what needs to be done in terms of passing the RECA. If portions of the TPA have been completed, that should be noted on the IDP, because as a reminder, when the candidate moves into the induction program, it is going to be the induction program who will need to ensure that the candidate has successfully completed and passed the CalTPA and or the RECA before the recommendation for the CLEAR can be made. Documentation of any outstanding requirements and professional progression towards mastery of the TPE should be included in the IDP. And again, as a reminder, it should be retained by both the candidate and the preliminary program in an electronic format. So it would be very important that as programs look at their IDPs, which are required by the program, to think about how they can include evidence of either prior cycles that have been completed or what needs to be completed in future cycles, as well as the RECA, as the candidate crafts and develops the IDP. So moving forward, Wayne, I wanted to give you an example of an IDP that is completed at Cal State Bakersfield. And if you'll notice, it has the name, the date, what credential is being worked on. It talks about any modifications to your final stage of student teaching during the spring. Now, this particular IDP has already been updated to include what might have changed or what might need to be looked at in terms of the way COVID affected the student teaching. Evidence from my preliminary program that tells the story of my teaching. So this is where the collaboration can help inform the IDP, feedback from a co-teacher, from a supervisor, student work, TPA results, etc. People who have examined this evidence with me, and notice now we get into the areas of strength as I transition to induction. These areas are reflected in the following CSTP elements, and what areas of growth as the candidate transitions to induction, and again, how they can be translated into the CSTP elements. So this is just one example, and again, this is retained electronically by the university, but also the candidate would have a copy as well. So Wayne, if you'll go, we'll look at another example. This particular IDP is from Whittier College. And the way that this is constructed is that at the top, there's a self-assessment that is completed by the teacher or teacher candidate. There's a place for a student signature, a college supervisor, and the master teacher to show that there was done with the idea of collaboration. The CSTPs are along the y-axis on the left, and it goes CSTP 1 through 6. And notice that in the first column, what knowledge skills do I already have? And then my goals for increasing knowledge and skills. Again, what am I doing well? How might I wish to improve? And then on the second page are examples of how the candidate can look at a timeline as he or she moves into their first job. So they would set a goal, a strategy to accomplish the goal. What do I need to help me accomplish my goal? So what resources would be important to have at their disposal? What is their timeline? And then a place for them to identify the status of how they are completing their work. And again, both documents would be taken to the induction program to help provide a seamless transition from preliminary to induction, because as we all know, induction is guided by the work of a mentor, and the mentor takes the candidate where he or she is and takes them to that next level. So this particular IDP definitely allows for there to be continued growth with the goals that the candidate has identified. So Wayne, if we can move forward to the next slide. Here's some resources that I wanted to point out to you. A program sponsor alert was issued in 2018. It was in September, and it clearly identifies the IDP and what should be included. Also, I would encourage folks to look at both the preliminary program standards as well as the teacher induction program standards, as they help to show how the IDP leads into the ILP of induction and what role it plays in helping the mentor and the program establish those goals. And the other item that I included on here is the Preliminary Teacher Preparation Program Update webinar that was done earlier this month, or even at late May, after the executive order was issued, that really talks about the ways that IDPs can include all those other items as the candidate moves from the preliminary into the clear. And what I have now is at the end of my formal presentation, and so Wayne, maybe just move forward and we can take any questions either from what I have discussed, or maybe if folks have had a chance to percolate on what Bob has shared, and we can move forward with those as well. Because we have about 3 minutes, and so I would want to address any questions that may come from the group.
And James, I just wanted to point out, I did put the URL to the CalTPA YouTube playlist.
Yes,
in the chat window.
Yes, and this virtual think tank, after it renders, we hope to have it up by this afternoon.
And Bob has also put his email address in the chat window should anyone wish to reach out to him with questions directly.
So as James has indicated, this will be posted on the Commission YouTube channel. So if you have other colleagues or even teacher candidates that you think would benefit from this information, please direct them to our YouTube channel so they can go back and take a look at this after the fact. And also the PowerPoint will be available for you if you would like to also take a look and have a copy of that. So since we are at the top of the hour, I would go back and like to thank Bob and James and Lori for monitoring our chat as being part of our presentation today, and thank all of you for taking part out of your summer schedule here and being with us this past hour. And we will look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.